This is kind of a funny story from the Republican period in China, from the final years of the Western exploration of China's western and northern frontiers, a region often called Inner Asia. And this involves a case of mistaken identity or mistaken identification on the part of the local police. And to unfold the story, we have to follow the trail through the archives of the history of the Chinese Republic, which contain the secret police files exchanged at the time. And within the archives, a group of documents are devoted to Aurel Stein, the Hungarian British explorer and scholar who had by that time become famous because of his excavations in Xinjiang and Gansu. And among this group of documents, there is one that is called Report of the Government of Jehol Province regarding the copying of Buddhist scriptures by the Hungarian national Aurel Stein. And this report talks about a Hungarian scholar who's been moving around Jehol Province. And of course, because Stein was so famous by this time, people thought that if he was Hungarian, he must have been Stein. But he was not. Instead, this was the young Louis Ligeti, or Lajos Ligeti, who was to become a major scholar of Mongolian and Turkic studies, and later served for 20 years as the vice president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Just before coming to study in China, he had studied in Paris with Paul Pelliot and Henri Maspero. And then he returned to Hungary, where he obtained a 3-year scholarship to study Tibetan Buddhist texts in the monasteries of Inner Mongolia. And Ligeti was not an archaeologist. He did not excavate. He was simply staying in monasteries, studying the language and reading Buddhist texts. By contrast, by this time, Aurel Stein was rapidly becoming a persona non grata in China because of the recent changes in national sentiments. He was often seen as an example of imperialist exploitation of China and its cultural heritage. And some Chinese scholars were strongly against allowing Stein to continue his excavations in Western China. In the late 1920s, the main voice against foreign excavation and surveying in China was that of the Society for the Preservation of Cultural Objects, an unofficial organization consisting of scientists and scholars, many of whom had been educated abroad. In 1927, there were 2 major foreign expeditions that were in the process of being organized, and thus they became the main target of the society. One of them was Sven Hedin's 1927 expedition, which was only allowed to proceed after Hedin agreed that it would be a joint Sino-Swedish expedition, and he would finance the cost of the Chinese members, and then leave the spoils of the expedition in China. The other major foreign enterprise at this time was the Mongolian expedition of the American Museum of Natural History, headed by the adventurous naturalist and explorer Roy Chapman Andrews. But while Hedin was flexible enough to allow Chinese participation, Andrews refused to consent to this, and so his expedition could not proceed. By 1931, he gave up on the idea of doing any further expedition in China and was forced to withdraw from the country altogether. Aurel Stein, of course, was well aware of these difficulties and did his best to mitigate the problems. So in April and May 1930, he visited Nanjing, the capital of Republican China, in person, to secure a travel passport for his expedition and also an excavation permit. And his preparations were actually quite successful because he managed to obtain a passport even though he was no longer allowed to do excavations. But he thought that he would be able to deal with these limitations on site. His success, however, ignited further discontent on the part of the society, who began actively lobbying against allowing Stein to proceed with his expedition. And so there were quite a few negative reports about Stein in the media at that time. And these were, of course, also read in Jehol Province, where Ligeti was studying Tibetan Buddhist texts. On the 31st of May, 1930, Academia Sinica issued a public letter calling for the prevention of Stein's expedition to Western China. This letter began with the condemning summary of Stein's past activities in China. This part read, "The Hungarian Stein has already visited Xinjiang and other regions 3 times in the past, and has stolen and carried off many antiquities, such as the Dunhuang manuscripts, the Sitrui bamboo slips, Buddhist statues, and murals. He had had no prior permission from Chinese authorities and has inflicted serious damage on Chinese historical material." And the reference to Stein's Hungarian nationality is not quite true because by this time, Stein had already taken British citizenship and was even knighted there. But partly because of the letter by Academia Sinica, the 19 government sent out a directive to local administrations in northwestern China, calling for vigilance with respect to Stein's archaeological activities in the region. And even though Stein was able to carry through quite a few months of archaeological work in western China, eventually his visa was revoked and he was forced to leave the country. But that's a whole other story we're not going to talk about here. Instead, we go back to Jehol Province, where Louis Ligeti was staying, and local authorities were seeing him with extreme suspicion, thinking that he might actually be Aurel Stein. We're fortunate that Ligeti wrote quite a few accounts of his time in northern China. One of the main ones is a book in Hungarian, Sárga Istenek, Sárga Emberek. So, Yellow Gods, Yellow People. I guess it's not a very PC title anymore. But it's a really interesting read with lots of humor and actually a quite detailed description of his life while he was there. He published this book in 1933 after coming back from China, and unfortunately there is no English translation. There has been a Chinese translation recently using the same title, so 黄色升起,黄色人民. If somebody is interested, the book is available in Chinese. And Ligeti also wrote about what happened to him there in a number of letters sent to friends and colleagues, and he also published a long report in French, and that focuses more on the scholarly results of his work in China. And of course, in the Republican archives, we see the other side of the story, and there's a telegram dated 9th of September 1930, and this is a report of the government of Jehol Province regarding the copying of Buddhist sutras by the Hungarian national Aurel Stein. The document is signed by Tang Yulin, the governor of Jehol. And the beginning of this report says that they launched an investigation in response to the directive calling for vigilance regarding Stein's activities. And so it's very clear that because of these directives sent out to local governments, that the governor of Jehol stepped in when he heard that a Hungarian scholar turned up in the Yoshun monastery in Chaoyang and began copying Buddhist scriptures. The investigation was carried out by Li Zhongxiang of the 1st Police Precinct, according to the instructions of Tian Yufeng, county police chief. And so Li Zhongxiang reported back to his superiors, saying that this person has a different name. He's called Li Ligeti, which was the transcription of Ligeti. And he's also very interested in Buddhist remains and relics, and he's also Hungarian, but his name is actually different. So then they didn't really proceed any further with this investigation. Ligeti stayed in the Yoshun monastery for 2 months, and he was able to find quite a number of interesting texts about which he wrote in his French report. But in his popular account, he writes about his staying at the monastery in a much more light-hearted and funny way. He actually writes about the police chief Tian Yufeng, but mistakenly calls him Tian Fengyu. And so this is what he writes. I ensconced myself in the monastery and, as far as it was possible, made myself comfortable in Deva Chenpo's rather uncomfortable dwelling, eager to begin working. As a measure of foresight, I gave strict instructions to Lil Song, Deva Chenpo, and to Dambinyima, the Shabi, to resolutely deny my being home if anyone came to call on me. I had enough experience with nosy visits that were utterly pointless and only kept me from working for extended periods of time. One day, a number of policemen of various ranks came over in an attempt to see me. It would not have been a good idea to turn them away, and it seemed that Deva Chenpo shared the same opinion, as he led them straight in, one after the other. Whispering in my ear, he at once let me know what great dignitaries were visiting me, and that, for both his and the monastery's sake, I should give them a friendly reception. And then he talks about this police officer who came to see him on behalf of the chief of police, Tian Yufeng, only he calls him Tian Fengyu. So this is what he writes about this. The procession was opened by a polite officer. He saluted me in a military manner and declared that he was visiting me on behalf of Tian Fengyu, the chief of police, and should I feel the need, they would be happy to place 2 guards in front of Deva Chenpo's door for my safety. As much as I was touched by their kindness and consideration, I anxiously protested against measures of this kind. I had absolutely no need for 2 good-for-nothing soldiers lurking around me all day, not leaving me a minute of peace. not to speak of their salaries and rations, which I would have been expected to provide. And in response to receiving his name card, the chief of police came and visited Ligeti personally that very same day. And he immediately turned to the main lama in the monastery and scolded him for keeping Li Xiansheng, that is Ligeti, in such a dirty hole. And this is how Ligeti describes this episode. Lama Chen was lost for words, anxious to come up with an answer, while inside he surely blamed me for the new troubles with the police, as if they did not have enough of these already. I came to his rescue by saying that he had actually wanted to give me a much better room, but I insisted on taking this one on account of Deva Chempo being a famous astrologist. Deva Chempo's eyes glistened with gratitude. Lama Chen was also appeased, and even Tianfeng Yu's anger dissipated. Although he no doubt thought that foreigners were crazy to choose of their own accord to live in such filth. And further on, Ligeti recounts his adventures with this Tianfeng Yu, calling him the polite policeman because he showered Ligeti with a multitude of small and useless gifts, each of which had to be reciprocated with a gift of European origin. Since by this time Ligeti was on a very tight budget, this caused him quite a bit of headache. He also described that this polite policeman often came and visited him, inquiring about the prices for certain antiquities abroad. And this was primarily because Governor Tang was a great collector, and Tianfeng Yu knew very well how important it was to be interested in the same thing as your superior. In any case, I think this is a very good example when we can see something from multiple different angles. So on the one hand, we have the reports by the local police and the governor of Jehol, and on the other, we have Ligeti's detailed description of what was happening with him while he was in the city of Chaoyang. And then we even have a third angle, and that is Ligeti's academic report of his research there. So these are three completely different angles about something that happened in 1930 in northern China. Hope this case was interesting. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thank you for watching and see you next time.